about the distinction between intent and capability. As I understand it, one of China's strategic intentions is to deny the US Navy and military more broadly dominance in the Western Pacific, to be the military hegemon in this particular time zone, in this part of the world. Is this a significant step towards making clear that intent and the capability to enforce it?
The short answer to your question is yes, but there is a question of being the hegemon, and that's a matter for debate. Whether China as a nation sees itself in that way, and of course what's more important is how other people see it as well. I won't debate the question of being the hegemon, but there is a very legitimate sense in the Chinese thinking around exerting their own authority, especially in their own region, and being able to demonstrate that they are not willing to be contained by the United States in the Western Pacific anymore.
The context in which I put that is when Xi Jinping talks about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. My understanding of that, and I don't claim to be an expert in this area, is that with the exception of Taiwan, China doesn't have any aspirations to acquire more territory. They're not like the former Soviet Union in that respect. But what they want, I think Xi Jinping means, is a restoration of what used to be the order of things at the height of the Ming and Qing empires, where other countries in the region would periodically pay tribute, in inverted commas, to the emperor in Beijing and wouldn't do anything of which the Chinese empire disapproved. That's the state of affairs that, in my understanding, China wants in this part of the world, that other countries pay heed to what China wants, that they don't criticize anything that China does, and that provided they, in Beijing's eyes, behave themselves, they'll be allowed to go about their own affairs.
I think that's a very fair proposition. The notion of whether China does or does not have aspirations in terms of territorial expansions, some might argue that that's not quite the case. Some might say, well, Taiwan would be that, and they would say, I suspect, Taiwan is an errant province of China and always has been. So it's the reunification that we're looking towards. And some might say what China's been doing with some of the reefs in the South China Sea could be seen as steps towards territorial claims, and yes, to an extent. But I think what's actually happening in respect of China's aspirations here is a bit more nuanced, and it's also a bit more responsive to what it's been experiencing over now several centuries at the hands of a number of colonial powers. And we have heard talk from China of redressing a century of humiliation that they feel, which I think, if we were to be honest with ourselves, we could find an accommodation for how they might feel like that. Also, we would say, we the West would say, with substantial assistance from the West, they have been a spectacularly successful country, elevating hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and yes, that's true too. So it's a richer story, I think, than just one of seeking hegemony in the region or more broadly. It's a response and a desire to redress the things that they as a nation have experienced as well. It's important to thumbnail quickly their strategic circumstances. China is a country which has the longest land frontiers of any country in the world, and it is bordering more other countries than any other country in the world as well. And it has only one sea frontier, and that is the South and East China Seas. That's really important in understanding the broader context of China, and particularly its rise. Their economic prosperity, the growth to the prosperity that we see exhibited by China today, which has been contributing to them becoming the world's largest navy, all relies to a very large measure on two things that are dependent on the sea. And Australia is the same. The first of those is the vast quantity of raw materials that they need to fuel their economy can only come by sea. The transportation of such vast quantities by any other means is impractical, and that notwithstanding their land borders. So you can't cart the sorts of volumes of iron ore and coal on trucks that you can cart by sea. So they are dependent on shipping trade into China to fuel their economy. They are equally dependent on shipping trade leaving China to take those products to the world's markets. So their concern about their own freedom of manoeuvre, which is intensely focused for them on their one sea frontier in the South China and East China Seas, this is critical to their survival. And this then leads us to the question of containment. So why would they be worried about interference with that shipping in and out? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that most of their petroleum, which is essential for all of this, comes through one of the tightest international straits on the globe, the Malacca Straits. If someone chose to interrupt that, to block it, it's a relatively simple choke point to block. Now, why would anyone do that? Well, for obvious reasons, to cut off their flow of oil. And if you think back to only a few years ago where that large container ship blocked the Suez Canal for a couple of weeks, the world was thrown into a degree of chaos and concern by that simple event. It was only a couple of weeks. And then fast forward from there to the recent Red Sea attacks on shipping by the Houthis in the south of Yemen. Well, that's had a similar effect, and it's caused shipping to be rerouted by the much longer south of Africa route, and it's disrupted shipping quite significantly, which of course has had significant economic impacts on the global economy and many, many countries connected with it as well. So that's of great concern to China, but equally the pathways in and out of the South China Sea to various parts of the world are of great concern to them as well. Why are they so worried about that? I mean, in some respects, we say we're worried about the Chinese, with whom we have the greatest trading partner relationship in the world. That is to say, largest, not necessarily greatest in quality, but largest trading partner is China. And most of our trade is shipping. So why would we be worried about interfering with shipping coming from Australia to go to China? Well, maybe it's not us that they're worried about. Maybe it's somebody else. Might they be worried about interfering with their shipping? And this goes to the notion of containment. Many people will have heard of the first and second island chains.
Yes.
These chains of islands, first being closest, second being furthest away from the Chinese mainland, in and bordering the South China Sea. And I must say I was intrigued in researching this recently. I had always had the view that the first and second island chains were a Chinese strategy, but they're not. They're an American strategy. The first and second island chains as a strategic notion were invented by John Foster Dulles in 1951 at the height of the Korean War, which has never been finally resolved, as we know. And they were very specifically created by America as a containment strategy against China and then Soviet Union. They are a very conscious, very deliberate American strategy of containment. So who the Chinese might be worried about interfering with their shipping is logically America. Well, why would America do that? Well, it probably wouldn't unless it felt threatened. And when you've got now the largest navy in the world counterbalancing your own previously largest navy in the world, it's probably an understandable thing that America might be a bit concerned about that. So let me just put that into a slightly broader context for people as well. First and second island chains, if you overlay on the picture where the American bases are, you have Japan, Okinawa, Guam, South Korea, access in Singapore, new base being built to replace the old one in the Philippines. This is a lot of military.
And now Darwin and Perth.
Well, Darwin and Perth as well, and Tyndall, and access to Australia. So if you're Chinese, you'd look at this and see quite a lot of military containment on your doorstep, presumably much of it nuclear armed, tactical nuclear weapons, not strategic. Let me put slightly more context around that and do a comparison for you. The South China Sea is slightly larger than the Gulf of Mexico, now the Gulf of America. It is only slightly larger than the Gulf of Mexico. And if we think back to the time when Khrushchev was going to put some nuclear missiles in Cuba, this was, why would they be doing that? Well, it was a response to what was happening in Europe. America's response was probably entirely predictable. We don't want that to happen, and we will take significant military steps to stop it happening. And they did, and as some will recall, that is, we think, about as close as we've come to a nuclear exchange between two nuclear powers since nuclear weapons were first actually used in anger. Now we have this standoff again in a slightly different way, in a slightly different part of the world, reflecting a view in China that this containment is something they no longer need to put up with. They're strong enough militarily to stand up against it and to take steps to push it back. And America is going to respond as it does. And the tensions that we see playing out here between nations, these two nations particularly, reflect their views of each other. And it could be seen and is often argued as going to the question of America not being willing to abandon its global primacy on the one hand, but on the other hand, having a somewhat reduced capability against a rising China to maintain that global primacy. So there's big issues at stake here that go well beyond Australia's particular interests, although we have a broader interest. And in that respect, the activities of the PLA-Navy in the South China Sea, in terms of building up air bases and so on, the deployments of ships to far-flung areas a long way away from their own bases, be that West Coast America, East Coast Africa, the Baltic and Europe generally, and Australia and further south, is demonstrating to the world the arrival on a bigger stage in the world, in a military sense, of a nation which now owns and operates the largest navy on the planet.
Which in some ways echoes Theodore Roosevelt sending the Great White Fleet out to, among other places, Sydney, I think 1907, doesn't it, was announcing America's arrival on the global scene.
It is absolutely a parallel, remembering too that Australia invited, against the wishes of Great Britain, invited the Americans to send the Great White Fleet. If you look at this overlay, it's easy for me to see echoes of the circumstances that we faced in this part of the world in 1937, 1938.